Now, you might remember a few months ago, I suppose, in the midst of last year, there were an awful lot of moped muggings going on. People were stealing motorbikes and mopeds mostly, taking them and ramming them into people, taking people's bags, robbing people at gunpoint, robbing people at knife point, and basically taking off on their mopeds. Now, the police decided this was such an epidemic that they had to do something about it. They were pressurised by the public to do something about it. And rather surprisingly, as far as I was concerned, they came up with this policy whereby police cars and police drivers were going to be taught how to knock these people off the mopeds so that they could actually be stopped and arrested. Now, I knew that that was going to end in tears. I knew that that was going to end in either one of these moped muggers being run over and killed under the wheels of a car, or possibly banging his head. There was a rule about not chasing people who weren't wearing crash helmets in case they fell over and hit their heads and died. I knew that this would all come to a sticky end, and sure enough, that is precisely what has happened. We now have a situation where one particular individual police constable, Edwin Sutton, is going to go to a disciplinary hearing today, could lose his job because he could be found guilty of gross misconduct for knocking somebody off his moped while driving a police car, which was in fact the order that he was given by his superiors. It seems very unfair on PC Sutton, but it does prove that you cannot just be cavalier about how you run police operations in this country. Let's talk to Dai Davies, former head of Royal Protection, former police officer, of course, himself. Dai, very good morning to you. Welcome.
Yes, good morning to you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us once more. I mean, I have to say, I don't like to be proved right in situations like this, but I'm afraid I was the sort of lone voice at the time saying this is really a very bad idea. People were up in arms about being mugged by these maniacs on mopeds, and they were very happy to see that the police were willing to do something about it. But I knew that it was going to end in tears, and sure enough, so it has.
Well, absolutely. We don't know the circumstances of this particular case.
Right.
But I think I did agree with you and others who commented at the time that I had real concerns about this. And having been a former area car driver as a young constable and chased people, many of them, you were always conscious of the fact that if they little darlings hurt themselves or you caused it, you were in trouble.
Yes.
And again, we don't know the full facts of this particular case, whether he went beyond what is regarded as reasonable. But knocking anyone off a bike, in my humble opinion, can't be that reasonable unless it's to save life. And again, we don't know the circumstances. But again, as you say, where are the senior officers standing alongside him if indeed he was carrying out a lawful order?
Well, quite right. And the trouble is, for working police officers, this is the last thing they want to see. They don't want to see their colleagues sort of being prosecuted effectively, albeit in a disciplinary sort of scenario, because they will think, well, it could be me next. And if I do something that I've been told to do by my superior officers, how is it fair if I then get hauled before the beak for it, as it were?
Well, absolutely. And this is why they still have trouble finding officers to volunteer to be firearms officers. Because if you shoot somebody wrongly or by mistake, or somebody sitting in a warm office decides years later that you were wrong, that's a problem. And it's a problem policemen and women have always faced, that they're in the front line and those above them certainly aren't most of the time. And I have much sympathy as a former street cop in most of my ranks. So I really do feel, again, without commenting particularly on this case, you know, you did warn it, and one or two of us also warned. But, you know, what is wrong in this country is the juvenile structure, how we deal with these thugs.
Yeah.
There is little or no fear either of the police or the court system, because lawyers make a fortune defending them. It goes on for months and months. They're on bail, because these days there's a presumption to bail. And if you're under 18... there is little chance that you will go inside for any kind of length of time, be it knife, be it stealing, whatever. And that's what the problem is. And politicians can wring their hands and say, well, why should the police take the risks? In my day, we did. And sometimes we broke the law to defend people. Policemen, men and women today, won't do that, and that's the difference.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think it was only yesterday, I think, Di, that there was a story coming out of Essex where police had gone in to arrest somebody who was supposedly joyriding around on a stolen moped. And while they were in the course of doing the arrest, or carrying out the arrest, they had petrol thrown on them, they had knives pulled on them. You know, all of these people who were doing this were kids, by the way. And as you say, they seem to feel as if they are more or less kind of unapproachable by the police.
Well, this is the problem, and the poor old police. I think the statistics on attacks on police, hospital people, is so alarming these days, and yet, what are we fanning around about bloody Brexit all day long? Why don't we get a grip of what's happening in this country, these useless politicians of all parties? And I despair, frankly, and I've been in this business 50 years, and I just wish somebody would get a grip.
But how do we find a way out of this, Di? Because you're absolutely right. What you've just said, I think, will resonate with everybody who listens to this show, who will say, thank God somebody in authority is actually saying what I believe. But here's the problem, right? Because I knew that this was this moped policy was going to come back and bite them on the backside. I knew that because police officers now are limited in what they can do. I'm quite surprised in a way that nobody's been hurt more than they have been. I'm quite surprised that somebody hasn't launched a lawsuit at them, because that's the world in which we now live. So how do we navigate a path between, not doing something which is likely to cause injury and or cause people to sue the police, and how do we get them to be firmer and in some ways more scary, I suppose, is the question.
Well, I think we have to look at those who set the sentencing. I think there needs to be a royal commission into how we're tackling crime in this country, because clearly in many areas we are failing. And I would want every chief constable and these useless commissioners that we have, who do absolutely nothing to further the fight against crime, in my opinion, we need to hold them far more to accountable. The problem is the Tories brought these commissioners in who allegedly represent us. Well, they clearly don't represent the vast majority of us, and they're certainly not holding many chief constables who continue to caution people for carrying knives, for stealing, you name it. But equally so, we have to look at those who are responsible for sentencing, and we need to change the law. We need to bring back detention centres. We need to bring back borstalls. We need to give some discipline and structure to some of these feral young in our society, because clearly if they've got fathers, they're not doing it, and if they've got mothers, some of them, they're not doing it either. And it's everybody else's fault apart from the youngsters themselves. Well, I think I'm so sorry, but we need to get a bit tougher in every aspect of life today against these feral kids who are causing mayhem.
Right. And I mean, we were hearing only yesterday that some people want to increase the age of criminal responsibility. Not that I think that's an issue here, not that I think that would make a blind bit of difference anyway, but there is a very genuine fear in many communities that there are these feral kids and they are roaming about and nobody can do anything to stop them. And it's only a matter of time, I think, before there is some kind of maybe community backlash against them.
Well, as I say, I've been hearing this for many years now, Graham. At the end of the day, it's the same story. It's been going round and round for all these 50 years that I've been involved in policing and related activity. I say again, I think it's worse now than ever before. The respect for the police in many areas is non-existent. And I think the police sometimes are not very well led these days.
No, I think you're absolutely right. So what's the answer, though, Di? I mean, this is what we try to do here. I know there's not always a straightforward answer, but what would you do if you were in charge of, say, even just one constabulary?
Well, when I was working with the FBI in L.A., Los Angeles, everybody sat down. Judges were not remote. My friend was a judge. He would meet with police chiefs, with social workers, and anybody else who contributed, and they would decide a joint strategy to deal with whatever was the cause of things. I'm not saying they were perfect, but at least those in authority sat together, and there wasn't this huge gap between those who set the law and those who carry it out.
Yes.
Now, that's one idea that I would put forward. But I'd also, when it comes to elections, and God knows we have too many of those too, but I would want to hold every single MP, and I'd want to see what his or her strategy was for dealing with crime, because they can all talk a good job. Very few of them actually do a good job. And I think that's the key areas. We worry about the National Health Service, and don't get me going on that one. But seriously, we really, really have got to get a grip of this, and politicians need to be held to account. And if you're a screaming lefty liberal, as far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't vote for you, for the reason that you're talking often through your backside. And that's the problem.
And you're also undermining the rule of law quite often if you are coming from that particular perspective.
There's a certain shadow Home Secretary who has a a track record of doing that.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's face it, looking at what happened when Extinction Rebellion came to London and decided to bring the city to a standstill, you know, hardly anything happened to any of them, and hardly any of the police seemed capable of moving them along and saying, thanks very much indeed for your demonstration. You've now been sitting on Waterloo Bridge for 5 hours. It's time to vacate it. Nobody did that.
In my day, it was, the strategy for dealing with public order was capture the high ground first. In other words, you get there and you capture it. So your strategic arterial routes, you are there to ensure, as far as you can, and again, if it's overwhelming odds, you can't always do it. But, you know, if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail.
Yes.
And often that's the case these days, because half these people in charge haven't been there in the big riots that we grew up with and the IRA attacking us. And a lot of these people have forgotten the chaos that was caused in the 70s and 80s and even early 90s by the Provisional IRA and the Socialist Workers' Party and others who deliberately would go out, one, to hurt policemen, but also to cause riots and mayhem.
Yeah.
And again, in my time, we've had politicians who have supported that. So God help us, is all I say.
Yeah. Would it make any difference if we armed the police or we made them able to use things like tasers more readily?
No, listen, I walked around with a whistle and a truncheon when I first did, and I didn't feel the need for either of those things.
Yeah.
Yes, occasionally, of course, you have to have firearms in these days, but no, most policemen still don't want to carry firearms full-time. The clue is, one, support them, two, ensure that you have sufficient numbers day and night to respond quickly and succinctly. Armed police around the world doesn't stop terrorism, as we've seen all over the world. The ability to lock them up. Look, we've just left that lunatic out, haven't we?
Well, yeah.
You just can't make it up, can you?
I know, it really is absolutely extraordinary. But I do like your idea, Dai, about sort of people talking to one another, because there's a kind of mistrust and a distrust between the judiciary and the police force. I mean, I don't ever really, whenever I've covered cases in court, in criminal court, you don't get the sense that judges are in any way keen on police officers at all.
Well, judging is solicitors. Do you know one profession there's more of in prison than any other is solicitors? And they come from that class and they look after each other, don't they?
Well, they do. Listen, Dai, it's an absolute delight to speak to you. Thank you so much for coming on, because you are a breath of fresh air and very welcome always in the Independent Republic of Mike Graham, where we don't need police because we ridicule anyone who makes a fool of themselves and they don't come back. Dai, thank you very much indeed. Dai Davies, former head of Royal Protection, absolutely amazing man. What a bloke to have as your ally on the front line of dealing with criminals. That's the kind of person you want running the police service in this country, rather than the people we have got. As Dai quite rightly says, there's no proper coordination between the people who make the laws and the people who have to carry the law out. And that, I think, would be a step forward, a massive step forward in this battle to try and get control back of our streets. Because clearly the police's idea that you can run over and run into moped muggers, knocking them off the bike and then arresting them, has backfired massively, as I said it would, and you said it wouldn't. All of you out there were saying, oh, yeah, this is a great idea, finally, you know, taking back control. Well, they didn't take back control, because now it looks as though one individual police officer might lose his job over it. And he doesn't deserve that, does he?